Well, good morning and welcome to our first Endless Studios live stream. My name is Brian Alsbach, and with me here is,
Natalie Messnard, nice to see you guys this morning.
and we are going to be your hosts for the next few weeks of our Endless Studios live stream. We're pretty excited to be trying out this format and to be working with all of you in the course. Uh, we're going to be live streaming twice a day, every weekday, Monday through Friday, for the next couple of weeks. So we'll be live here at 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. Eastern Time. So that would be 8 a.m. and 1 p.m. Pacific Time for 1 hour in each stream. And we're going to be doing a bunch of stuff on the live stream all around our Endless Studios game making program. So, Natalie, I think we wanted to kick things off today just talking about the program a little bit at a high level. So, I will, even though I know a lot about it, I'm going to play the role of interviewer and ask you a few questions about what's going on in the program. But I'll let you start by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I am Natalie Messnard, and I'm the master instructor at Eline Media, work with Endless Studios to make games and teach you guys how to make games. I am totally passionate about game making. I love video games. Um, a little bit of my background is I've always been a creative person. I studied creative writing in school and also math. So I have one of those dual brains that likes both technical things and thinking deeply about engineering and logic. And I also really like to tell stories and think about characters. So I had the absolute privilege of actually studying both of those things in my education. And now that I work here with Endless Studios, I get to do it professionally. And that I couldn't have a better life. I just love doing it. Whether or not I'm making a tabletop game or working on a video game or showing someone else how to do it, um, I get to think about storytelling and math and what makes things fun and creating interactive, playful experiences. And that's just what I really love about game making. So, of course, I'll be one of your two instructors over the next few weeks. And, you know, I love teaching more people how to make games. So I'm really excited to help you guys join into this really fun discipline that Brian and I are both very much a part of. So, Brian, I'll hand it back to you. I'm sure the folks out there want to know a little bit about your background too.
Well, I don't know about that, but I'm happy to share it. So because I have no problem talking about myself. No, so but in all seriousness, so my name is Brian Alsbach. I am the executive vice president of learning here at Eline Media. Eline is a company that does. We started it a little over 10 years ago now, and we're a little bit of an eclectic game company. We make games and publish games, but every game we make or publish has some sort of an educational or impact angle. And personally, in my life, I've been very passionate about that concept of using games as a way to teach people and introduce them to things that they might not otherwise have experienced. Now, we make games both in the commercial world and in the educational world. So, in the commercial world, we've made a few game projects that you might have heard of. We did a game about 5 years ago called Never Alone, which was an atmospheric puzzle platformer game we did in partnership with folks from the Alaska Native community based on one of their traditional stories. Uh, about a month ago, actually, we released a game called, as my phone goes off, I should have turned that off before we got on. That was very, very unprofessional. But a few weeks ago, we released a game called Beyond Blue, which is an undersea exploration game you play as a diver and scientific researcher. We did that game in partnership with the BBC based on their Blue Planet 2 documentary series. And you get to go as a diver and swim and meet 40 something different undersea creatures with a really cool soundtrack while you do it. And then we also have made a game called The Endless Mission, which starts to tie into our Endless Studios program here. One of the areas we've been really interested in is teaching young people game design. And we think making games is a great way to learn not only design skills, systems based thinking skills, and also the hard programming skills that you learn by making software. And so I've been really interested in that area. I've helped develop other games that do that, including another product from Eline called GameStar Mechanic, which is oriented towards a little bit of a younger audience learning about game making, but it's one that we're going to use in the Endless Studios program as well. And really thinking a lot about how we can take game making and make it an interesting bring interesting things and interesting ways to learn to that process. And in general, to make the process of learning game making a lot less like taking a course in school and a lot more like making games happens in a real studio. And that's part of the design of the program. And we're going to talk a little bit about that this morning, too. In terms of my personal background, I'm kind of a jack of all trades kind of guy. I like doing a lot of different things. And so one of the inspirations for this program, and I often tell this story, is back when I was in high school, way back in the day, we had a TV studio in our high school. And that was at a time where that was a big deal because to make live TV productions or even to edit TV, you had tape to tape editing systems, and you had really complex systems to do live broadcasting as opposed to being able to do it all on a PC like you can today. But that was really an amazing opportunity that I had, and we ran that thing like a little TV studio. And so I'm excited to bring some of those same principles running things like a real game studio as we do in our own professional game making. So that's a bit of a an introduction to who we are and what we're going to do. Natalie, I'll ask a few questions about the program to kind of set the stage. So I mentioned this notion of the program being based on or running like how a real game studio works. I guess I'll start with, what does that mean to you as one of the designers of the program? What does it mean that something works like a real game studio as opposed to a more traditional way of learning?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. And, I really think that um, if you want to differentiate between taking a class and being in a studio, um, one of the things you have to subtract out is the idea of doing something to earn a grade. Of course, in a class, you have this overriding objective of getting an A in the class, taking tests, and demonstrating to your teacher that you know what you're supposed to know. That's just kind of how a class works. And in a game studio, there isn't a teacher that's giving you a grade. It's much more of what I like to think of as a maker culture. And if you think about maker spaces and maker culture in general, you're thinking anywhere from the DIY folks you see on Etsy to people who do 3D printers to people who just gather together and make games because they're so passionate about games. And in that culture, it's just about making an excellent thing. So, if you're doing a maker culture DIY project to, for example, um, sew a shirt, right? You're just trying to make an excellent shirt. 3D printer, you're just trying to print out a beautiful object. And with a video game, you're trying to make an excellent game. And so instead of having this teacher tell you, yes, that was good or that wasn't enough, um, everyone decides. Everyone who plays your game can give an opinion about the excellence of the final product. And that community aspect is, to me, really what makes a game studio environment different than a class. And I think that's very much what this uh, Endless Studio Summer Camp is about.
So some of the other things, that are implied by studio. I'll start with maybe the most obvious one, is when you're in a studio, there are typically other people there, and you're typically working with other people to make games. Obviously, as a game maker, I know that and believe as I do that that's a huge part of making games. That you make games in collaboration with others very often, and then that's part of what it means to be in a studio. How does that get embodied in the program in Endless Studios?
So, one of the things that's important about um, working with other people is, like I said, getting their opinion on what you're making. And one of the main ways that we do that in real game studios and here is through play testing. So when you work on games in Endless Studios through your Endless Studios internship in this summer camp, part of the process requires you to release games and have your fellow interns, fellow campers play test your games. Now, Brian, we might want to briefly define what play testing is for those out there who are new to the um, game making world. But I feel like it's pretty easy to figure out from the word. It's playing a game to test it out. So you may play a game that's not finished at some point in this camp, and you'll have the opportunity to make suggestions to your fellow campers about what they could change, what they could improve, and maybe even say, I found a problem in this game. Something doesn't work. The game is glitching. Here's something that you could fix. But that relationship of getting playtesting feedback is very much what we do here, and in the spirit of that community ideal.
Yeah, and I think it's a great example because it's such an important part of game making culture, and it's one of the ways I think that a program like this or making games in general, we often find, Natalie, when we've done work with young people before, it's very different from what they do every day in a traditional classroom, right? Because folks are so used to, hey, I'm going to get an assignment, I'm going to work on it a little bit, I'm going to hand it in, and I'm done. Like it's fire and forget, right? I'm never going to think about that again. But on a professional game making team, that's never the way it goes, right? You're constantly working on little pieces of the game, testing them to see if they're better. When you have things that are stable enough for other people to play them, you're letting other people, whether they're folks on the team or whether they're folks outside the studio as you progress through the project working on it. And you're constantly using that feedback to make the game better. And there's almost never a point in time when you make a real game where you're like, that's it, I'm done, everything is finished, everything is great. That's a very rare outcome. Typically, the outcome is, oh man, I've run out of time, and my boss says I have to release this thing now so we can get it out on the market. And I know there's more I want to do. I know that there may be ways I can make it better, but at least now in the world of games with everything being distributed online, there are ways to address that too, because that's why you patch. But I think that's one of the ways in which we want to bring a value like that to our studio program, and why we think that collaboration and feedback is so important. I'll mention another way where I think it's important, and it's one of the things we're trying to do with these live streams. Is obviously Natalie and I are introducing the program. It's the very first one that we're doing, and so we're talking heads here in the live stream. But we do want these streams to be interactive, and so we're going to talk about one of the ways we're going to do that a little bit later on in the next 45 minutes or so we have left on this stream. But certainly one way you can do it is to interact with us in the chat. So if you're in the chat and you're participating in the program, please say hi. And if you have questions, whether it's about what we're talking about, whether it's about some of the things you're working on as you progress through the program, please do ask those of us, and we're happy to field them on the live stream and have a little bit of back and forth. And certainly as we do some of the things we plan on doing on the live stream, we're going to be asking for lots of feedback. These are going to become very interactive because we're going to be looking for suggestions from you in the audience. So
Yeah,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Natalie.
I was just gonna add on to that we love it when people chat, and we do really try to answer the questions you put in. So in the past, we've done some really fun casts uh, right here on this Twitch channel before we kicked off the camp, where we would play your video games and just talk about our playthrough of what games are like that people like you have made. So that's going to be one of your opportunities. In addition to following along in some of the projects we're working on, you can have us play your game just like streamers do on Twitch and give our thoughts, our reactions. And that's just a really fun way to release a game and get some play testing live. So if you're interested in doing that, this is definitely a place that is going to happen.
So we've talked, Natalie, about some of the values we're going to have in the program and some of the things we're going to do to sort of make it feel like a studio. And certainly when you spoke of that, you talked about the emphasis on making real games and that sort of guiding the process for folks participating in the program. Now I know both with the group of participants we have in this program, and I imagine for folks in general who are going to be working with us at Endless Studios, a lot of them have never made a game before. A lot of them have never maybe done some of the individual pieces that go into game making before, for example, programming. So if you're someone who's really new to this and that this is a new experience for you, and they hear you say, "Oh man, you're going to be making games," and you're like, "But I've never made games before. How do I do that?" What in this experience, where's the best place to start? How would I frame my experience if that describes me as I start my journey in Endless Studios?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, this camp, this experience is for people who have never made games. So, the first thing I would say is as you're coming in and getting started, you should know that if you're in that situation, this is for you. We have everything you need to start from zero and go to a excellent game maker. Now, that's not to say that if you've made games before, you should quit. Because, like Brian said, that's why patches exist, right? We're always improving, we're always working. And there's going to be a lot of opportunities for the more experienced among you to continue to hone your skills and get feedback. So, the thing I was just talking about of having your game be played on the live cast, that might be for a more experienced game maker. Whereas a very new game maker who's still learning the ropes of computers and has never programmed, we might not show that game yet. And we might start you out at the beginning with some of the activities in the classroom. So, of course, the camp has rooms, as you know. And if you log into the course website, you'll see there's a few different places you can go to start your learning journey. And no assignments, no tests. But what you have here is a lot of different materials that are going to set you off on the right track. And once again, those are right there in the classroom. So the classroom, study game making at your own pace. And if you start at the beginning there, you'll be on the right track.
Yep, and I've just brought that up on the screen here so folks can see. Here in the classroom, there are a whole bunch of units in game making. There are 13 units that make up our little intro course we have for purposes of this Endless Studios first go around, and you can progress through these, straight through, one after the other. Go unit one, go unit two. You'll see that kind of each row here ends with a game making project, and this is where one of the ways in which we connect the learning that goes on in the classroom with what Natalie described earlier of game making. As you move through the learning progression, you'll reach points like this, generally after every 2 learning units, where you'll have an opportunity to make a game making project that kind of synthesizes or brings together all of the things you've experienced in the course up to that point. Now, another thing you'll notice here, and it's kind of a good segue, Natalie, to the next question I wanted to ask, is when you look at those projects, you see that this very first one is called the GameStar Mechanic Project. Then we have a level design project and a modding project and a coding project, and then ultimately a full game project at the very end. So we've emphasized making games. We've emphasized that there are projects. So I guess, Natalie, one question that naturally might come out of that is what tools will participants in the program be using when they make their games?
Yep, that is an excellent question. And we have a few different tools that you'll be using. So, the screen we just saw shows a project built in a tool called GameStar Mechanic. And that is the tool you'll use for your first game project if you're going through the classroom. GameStar Mechanic is a very cool game making platform that you can access for free on the internet. It's a 2D game making platform that also teaches you about game design basics. So leading up to that project, you'll actually play some game making quests in GameStar Mechanic, which teach you about things like balance, meaningful choice, space, rules, goals, challenges, a lot of the concepts that go into what makes a game fun, regardless of what that game is. So that could be Monopoly, right? Same principles apply. And then you have this amazing tool for putting together a 2D level, in the vein of, Super Mario. You could make a side-scrolling platformer like that, or a top-down 2D game like an RPG. Um, so your first project is GameStar, and then after that, you kick off an exciting exploration of the Endless Mission. So the last series of games after GameStar Mechanic are all happening in the Endless Mission, which is a 3D game making software that looks very similar to the way Unity works, if you've heard of Unity or Unreal. You've got a full 3D development environment there. But the really cool thing about the Endless Mission is it comes with a bunch of really beautiful preloaded visual assets that you can just pull in and start to work with to set up gameplay logic, smart conditions, all of the kinds of things that you want to work with to learn what goes under the hood in games. You can just kick off right away without sourcing your own 3D models, which, of course, Brian, as we know, we could do a whole course here on 3D modeling, but the focus here is on learning how to make games. And so in Endless, you get all of those really beautiful resources to start working with. But Brian, I should turn it back to you. Is there anything that you think is important that our campers know about the Endless Mission editor or the Endless Mission in general that's going to help them do well on these projects?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you mentioned some of it, Natalie, in your answer. So I think two things. One is that we recognize, especially for folks who've never made a game before, there's a lot to take in here, and there's a lot to learn here, and in different areas, right? So the selection of tools that we've made to introduce that and to give you a chance at game making, we've tried to keep that in mind. So GameStar, you can make, as Natalie mentioned, relatively simple 2D games in a variety of different styles. And you can do that without programming. Our intention there is really to get you to focus on the design concepts and get sort of a familiarity with some of the key ideas that go into making a game, like how to create challenge, how to balance a game, and it all kind of adds up to how do you have a fun experience for your players, because no amount of knowing every coding technique or every technique for making a 3D model is a substitute for knowing how to make stuff really fun. And that's the most important thing when you make games, so you got to keep that in mind. Now, the Endless Mission as a tool is interesting in that that's also a tool like GameStar for learning, but it's very focused on introducing the game making concepts that are used in, as Natalie mentioned, Unity, which is a professional game making tool. So, for example, many commercial games that you've played are made using Unity. It is, in fact, the tool that we use in our game making studios here at Eline when we made Never Alone, which you see on the poster behind me, or Beyond Blue, or, in fact, The Endless Mission. They're all made using Unity, which is professional industry standard game making software. Everything about The Endless Mission, from the playable learning quests in it to the game editor and code editor tool that are built inside it, are based on Unity and designed to introduce the game making and coding concepts, the little tools that you use inside the game making user interface, how you interact with that, how to move stuff around and place it in a 3D world, the kind of coding techniques that you use when you make a Unity game. The Endless Mission is designed to present all of those things in a way that makes it easier for folks to learn, with the idea being that you can start there and then, as you learn more game making, ultimately level up to doing things in Unity, the real full professional tool. So you don't necessarily stay in the Endless Mission forever. And the other thing that goes along with that is that whereas GameStar is 2D game making, the Endless Mission is 3D game making. So you'll be able to make games in rich 3D worlds using the Endless Mission. So Natalie, another aspect of this I don't think we've talked about yet is we've talked a lot about the game making side of it. Obviously, one aspect of game making, and we've mentioned several, right? We've mentioned the design side. We've mentioned the visual or graphical side of creating things like 3D models or building the visual world of your game. I'll mention now, which I don't think we have, the producing side of making games, which, especially when you're working on teams, is very important. That's the process of sort of keeping the activities of everybody on the game making team coordinated and making sure that the game gets made on time, and if you have a budget, gets made within your budget, and that the quality is acceptable. And then, of course, I think maybe the area that folks associate most with video game making is the coding or technical or engineering side of game making. And we know that many of the folks in our program, we don't expect to have done any coding before. So, in the learning in the program, Natalie, and in the classroom, what are some of the things we're doing to introduce coding concepts, and what are the tools that we're taking advantage of there when we do that?
Sure. So, our idea of, and as game makers, we know that before you start doing any coding, you need to know what you're trying to implement in code. So, the side of our program that doesn't involve looking at actual code very much informs the coding that you will do in our course because it helps you learn what you want to do when you do sit down and start to write all that crazy stuff with the curly braces and the dots and all the things that we're going to help you decipher. So, really, one thing I would say about this course is every single thing in it helps you get good at coding games, even if you're not actually writing code in the lesson that you're doing, because it helps you learn, you know, okay, I want to make a game. I want the game to be fun. Okay, what do I need to do that? Well, it's a 2D platformer, and then you go on from there. That said, there are a lot of resources in here that are going to teach you those technical details. So, in the units of the course that focus on computer science, you are going to get to learn coding through playing video games. We have a suite of games called T2, which are short games that teach you different programming concepts through playing. And what that means is when you sit down to do those activities, you will not be sitting down at uh, just a wall of code like like in the Matrix, right? You're going to be sitting down to play a video game, which I do hope that most of you guys have played at least one or two. But if not, this is your time to start playing video games and enjoy the fun of doing that. Um, we also, in addition to those resources, have some more in-depth videos that do take you through the programming language that you use in real game making with Unity and indeed the Endless Mission. Brian, why don't I toss it back to you to talk a little bit about our resources on learning C sharp?
Sure. As Natalie mentioned, the programming language that both Unity and the Endless Mission use is a language called C sharp. So that's if you're familiar with it, that's an uppercase letter C followed by what you might call a hashtag or a pound sign or a number sign. What we pronounce it C sharp. It's also like the sharp symbol from music, which is where that actually comes from in the history of how that language got its name. Um, so C sharp is an industry standard language. It is a more recent addition in the history of programming languages to a whole family of languages in the C language family. So there was C plus, there was C plus plus, there was original C, and now there's C sharp. There are other C's. Objective C is another language. And they all have a common history and share common linguistic features. Because that language is so standard in the industry, it is, as we've mentioned, the language of the Unity game development environment. As we get into the practical game making stuff in the Endless Mission, and in some of the stuff we're going to be doing in Unity here on the live stream, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, the programming language will be C sharp. Now, one of the interesting things about programming is whatever programming language you're using, whether it's C sharp or Java or Visual Basic or Python, even though the details and what we call the syntax, right, the individual linguistic structures in the language will differ. Number one, they often have more in common than you might think. But number two, the same concepts will keep coming up again. One of the things we like about this approach, where we're going to introduce some of those concepts in the T2 Terminal 2 games that Natalie mentioned, is you'll get to see the same concepts in a number of different programming languages, right? And you'll be able to say, oh, look, that's a conditional statement again. That's a while loop again, right? That's a variable. Oh, look, this is how you create a variable in Python versus how you create a variable in C sharp, right? And That's something that a lot of introductory programming experiences don't do, but we think will be interesting here because it'll let you see how all of that stuff works in the context of different languages. But when we dive into that C# stuff in particular, we've prepared both projects and video lessons that will really deep dive into some of that and kind of go at a nice, we think, pretty reasonable pace to introduce the most common concepts that you're going to need. Now, the one thing I'll say to sort of summarize that is you can spend, and indeed many people do spend, an entire career learning coding concepts or just one specific area of coding, like coding for game making as opposed to, coding for making very complex database applications, right? Um, you're not going to learn all of game programming in this course. And indeed, you could never stop learning game programming techniques. Our goals for the game programming part of it are a little bit less around let me teach you everything, or hey, you as someone who's learning it should like memorize every single command or every single concept that we teach. It's a little bit more about giving you the building blocks so that you can understand what's going on in game code and sort of follow the set of instructions that the game will follow when it plays. And right, that's fundamentally that's all that code is, right? It's instructions that the computer follows to create the what you experience in this case as a game player. So my hope is that by the time you get through the programming stuff in C# in this course, you'll be able to at least follow along in any Endless Mission or Unity C# game script that you saw. And even if you don't understand what every single command does, you'll be able to understand the flow of what's happening. You'll go, well, I don't know what a lerp is, right? What is this command lerp? But I know that at this point in the code, after it's done these three things, it's telling this thing, this, object to rotate, and he lerps when he rotates. And so I can go and I can Google what a lerp is, and then maybe I can understand that, right? That's how real programmers work, and it's sort of what we want to prepare you to do as you take the coding portion of this course.
Yeah, and I think that just, that aspect of Googling and looking at code on the internet and trying to understand what it does is a real part of software development and specifically of game making. So if you have in your mind the idea that when programmers sit down, they open a blank window and they fill it with code, take that idea away because the thing that you're talking about, Brian, where you sit down with an existing script, sit down with existing code, and kind of try to figure out how it works and start from there. That's so much of what real game programmers do. And on the advanced level, there is, of course, some situations where you would create a script from scratch, but it's not like writing an essay. It's all about investigation and detective work and taking a deep dive when you need to. And then we have this idea of black boxing, which is having a general sense of what code does without analyzing every line of it. So those are the kinds of skills you'll be learning. So one of the things we're really excited about is for you guys to come into that mindset and dispel any illusions around what real hacking or what real coding is and do it like we do in a game studio.
And that's a great segue, Natalie, to I think the second set of topics we wanted to talk about on this live stream is one of the things we're going to be doing is we wanted to create an experience that would give those of you who are new to the game making process, which is most of you, a chance to see how real game making works. So one of the, if you will, like tracks or one of the things we're going to be doing on the live stream is Natalie and I are going to be working on a game mod together. We're going to take an existing game and we're going to go through the process of adding new stuff to that game to show you how that works sort of soup to nuts, from a thinking of new ideas to coming up with the details of the design to planning how you're going to implement that in code to designing your code implementation to actually making the implementation in code and then to testing and making sure that everything is working the way that it was intended. And we've purposely chosen to do that as a modding project rather than as a let's start and make a brand new game from scratch project, just for the reason that Natalie stated. We think seeing how an existing game is working, seeing how all the systems interact from a design perspective and from a technical perspective in code, we think is a great way to get up to speed. And we've purposely chosen to do that in Unity. So the game we're going to be working on there is a game made in the full Unity environment, and we'll be working in the full Unity game and code editing environments to do that mod of the game. Why are we doing that? Well, we wanted to give you a preview not only of the process and the techniques that professional developers use, but also the tools that are involved, right? And so even though working directly in Unity is not something you're going to be asked to do in either the classroom or the projects portion of the course experience, we're going to be doing it on the live stream. And it's not just something we're going to be doing and you're going to watch passively. So Natalie, if you would, could you talk a little bit more about how we're going to engage with and work with our course participants as we work on that project?
Sure. So, obviously, because we want this to be interactive, we want to involve you guys in the community of game development. And part of the way that you can participate on that through this project is by watching the live cast, checking out the project that we're setting out to do, and then giving input on how you want us to mod it. So there's a few different tracks that can take as the conversation evolves. Of course, we're looking for your comments in chat, and you can also make suggestions in the break room in the Endless Studios website about the direction you want us to go in with this project. But ultimately, what we're looking for is with you guys to come up with a clear map for how we're going to make this base game more fun. So the idea is as a community to play test and say, we want to add this. We want to change this. We have these ideas of how this game could be better. And then as we come to that as a group, then Brian and I here on the live cast will do a little bit of demonstration of then how you would take that idea and actually implement it using C sharp. So the idea here is to say, for example, if we all decided, let's put a power up in it, we're going to ask you guys things like, how often does the power up drop? How do you collect it? How long does the power up last? And you're going to have the opportunity to make decisions about that based on your sense of what makes a game system and an interaction fun and compelling and interesting. And then Brian and I are your leaders into the world of code where we would say, okay, you want the power up to last for 10 seconds. This is what that would look like in the C sharp script attached to that power up.
So I think to kick that process off, we wanted to spend a little time in this morning's live cast, and I think we'll spend some more time on it in the one later this afternoon, taking a look at the game that we're going to be doing that modding project with. So what I'm going to do is I am going to bring up the full Unity editor here and share my screen on the live cast. And Natalie, for now, because I don't think we're going to be looking at much code right now, I'm going to leave us up there in the corner so folks can see our happy faces.
Sounds good.
And let's bring that up. Okay, and let me bring up Unity. So right away, you're getting your first look at the full Unity editor here. This may seem a little bit intimidating, and we will definitely spend some time on the live cast explaining what the different parts of the editor are and certainly interacting with them as we actually get in there and start making our mods to the game. There are a couple of things I want you to focus in on now in this user interface, and they're the two most interesting things I think that you're seeing, or most graphical things that you're seeing. So over here on the left side of the screen, there are two windows that appear to be showing like visual things that kind of look like a game. There's a big difference between these two windows, and you use both a lot in making a Unity game. And I want to make sure folks are clear on them. And I'm going to start introducing some of the terminology of Unity game making, so that you know it. And when I refer to things by their names, you'll start to know what they are. So up here, I'll actually start at the bottom. Down here at the bottom is a window that is called the game view, right? And the game view is fairly self-explanatory. The game view is what, as a player, you would actually see if you were playing the game. In a little bit more technical terms, in the game, and you'll see how this works in Unity as we get into the mod, there's actually a virtual camera, we just call it a camera, in the game that you as the game maker have control over, that is looking at, if you will, what the player will see through the game's camera when the game actually plays, right? And so now, right now, this game isn't in play mode. The game is not running right now. And so you're not really getting an accurate representation of what the game camera would see, but you'll see more of that in a second, right? So that's the game view. Again, that's the lower of these two windows. The higher of the two visual windows here is called the scene view. And Natalie, I'll let you describe a little bit about what the scene view does, because it's somewhere where you're going to be spending a lot of time interacting with both Unity and the Endless Mission when you start making games in those environments.
Absolutely. So the scene view is where you make and edit your game. So Brian, if he wanted to, could actually start moving around in there and interacting with the various pieces of the game he's making. He's panning the scene camera to look at the menu there on the left. He can look at the level construction, the sky, and there's some weird little icons coming up there that represent audio. But what Brian's got there is, if you imagined your game like Legos, this is his little Lego workshop where he's assembling the pieces that go into the game when we play it. So, one thing I would say about Unity, and to compare Unity with a game making tool like the Endless Mission or even GameStar Mechanic, this scene view and this game view are also in those tools. But in those tools, in the Endless Mission Editor and in GameStar Mechanic, you just see them in the same place. So you'll see you can edit, and then when you press play on your game, then you can play what you edited. And in Unity, the only thing that's different is the window where you edit and the window where you play are separate instead of the same. So if you know that, it's really easy to understand how these work. We just say we have one window where we make our edits, and we have another window where we play the game and see what a player sees. And to loop back to what I said at the beginning, the one on the top there that Brian has is called the scene. You can think of a scene in a movie, right? We're setting the scene. And then the one below it is the game. And that's, of course, where we get to see the finished version of the movie. But we call it a game because it's not a movie, it's interactive. Does that about do it for the scene,
Yeah, and
Brian?
I'm actually glad you introduced the idea that those two windows are different here in Unity, but that they kind of get sort of collapsed into the same thing in something like GameStar or the Endless Mission. But it's worth noting, and I'll just take a minute and note it. Like, in a professional tool like Unity, why are those two different things, right? Like, why did the people who make Unity choose to separate those? What, function does it serve? Because obviously it makes things a little more complex and abstract. We've taken 5 minutes to explain it, right? So there's something to explain there. Um, and here's why that is. The game camera, the game window, is always showing what the game's camera is seeing. So if you were playing, say, a first-person shooter game, you're seeing through the eyes of the avatar. You're seeing exactly what that avatar is seeing at a given time, which means you're only seeing a portion of the game world, right? Now, when you are editing your game, you need to interact with it. And just like I was doing as Natalie was speaking earlier, I can move my what's called my scene camera anywhere I want to in this game world. And you see nothing is changing down in the game view, right? Because I'm only controlling this special camera that's like my God's eye view of this game when I'm editing it, right? The other thing I can do with this is if I was playing the game, right? I can focus my scene camera and still move it around anywhere I want or focus it on something that isn't what the game's camera is seeing. And that's incredibly useful in game development and especially in testing. I'll give you an example from our undersea exploration game that I mentioned a little bit earlier that we just released about a month ago. In that game, you control the diver, and so that's actually a third-person camera in the game. You see the diver, from over. Well, it's not really over their shoulder because they're swimming, but from behind, you see the diver swimming around the world, and therefore whatever is then in front of the diver, right? There are tons of sea creatures in each level, and they're on paths where they swim around and they have a path that they follow in the world, and then they swim around, and then sometimes they intersect with where the diver is and you see them, and then they go on their path. Well, that pathing is somewhat complicated. Those whales and fish and things are artificially intelligent, so they have some behavior where they follow the path, but they know, like, if another creature gets close, they know how to scatter and go back off the path and then rejoin it and do crazy stuff like that. And sometimes that doesn't work properly. So, we had this issue where you needed to interact with a certain whale in the game. And then sometimes you'd get to where the whale was supposed to be and like there'd be no whale and you could never find the whale. And when we researched it, we found it was because the whale was swimming when we used that scene view to follow that whale in the scene view at all times. The whale was swimming way, way, way down below the floor of where the diver could go in the world and would get lost, and it would block your progress in the mission because you couldn't get there. You couldn't scan that whale, right? And that's something we wouldn't have been able to debug unless we had the ability to follow that whale independent of what the game's camera was seeing. We could follow it in the scene view, right? That's the kind of issue that comes up all the time in one of the values of that system. But in the last 10 minutes or so we have on the stream, let's actually take a look at this game from a play perspective. And I'll introduce, I guess, one other concept about this game that's somewhat important to know as we think about its design, and we'll reflect on this a little bit as we start to talk about it and talk about how we're going to mod it, which is this is a game that was originally designed for VR, right? And so you can imagine playing this game with your VR headset on and with your VR controllers representing both of your hands, and that the movement of your head and your hands is mapped to how the camera and the two objects that you're holding in this game how they move in the game world, right? Now, obviously, we're on a live stream here, and we're also in a development environment that's not VR. It's just up on my monitor here on my computer that isn't VR. And so one of the challenges that people who are doing VR development have is that often people working on a VR game on a team, not everyone on the team has access to VR hardware as they're developing at any given point in time. And we're exactly in that state right now with this game. I don't happen to have a VR headset hooked up to this computer right now, but we're going to develop it. And so this game is set up in a certain way where I can do that, and I've done some of mapping of the VR controls to mouse and keyboard controls for development purposes so that a developer like me can work on this game even when we don't have our VR hardware present. But you still want to remember from a design perspective that this is a VR game, and that's going to come up in some of the specific choices that are made in the game. So I'm going to play it, and one other thing I'll show you is I talked about why you'd want to have your scene view and your game view up at all times while you were playing a game. But actually here, for this very first time, I don't want to do that. I want you to see what the play experience is like without all this other stuff being up and it being in a really small window. So if you look on my game view screen, there's this button that says maximize on play. And right now that is checked. I just unchecked it, but it's checked now. And what that's going to do is while we're in play mode, it's going to make the game view big so you actually won't see all of this other stuff, at least this first time or two that we go in and play. So I'm going to start playing the game now. And to do that in Unity, I hit this play button up at the very top, and that's going to play the game inside my local development environment. And I'm going to turn the game's audio on now too, so you can hear a little bit of the music and sound effects. And you can see it takes a second to load. And now we've started. So in this VR game, this is a shooting gallery style game. It's no different than maybe a shooting gallery game you've played at a carnival or a boardwalk or something like that. And you can see I have a blaster in one hand and I have a shield in the other. And right now, this menu is up in front of me, and there is a little blue ray coming out of the blaster that represents where I'm pointing, and I interact with it by clicking on that. So I'm going to start the game by pointing at play and clicking. So now I'm in the game, and you'll see in a moment some bad stuff is going to happen. So these enemy droids, hovering little drone-looking droid things, spawn into the game, and I've got to shoot them to win the game. And as they get close to me and they lock me in, you'll see some of them starting to shoot red laser blasts at me, and those damage me, and that's where my shield comes in, because I can raise my shield to protect myself from the laser blasts.
I hear some of them.
Yep.
Those guys are just relentless.
They are.
Droids.
And if I remember the current design correctly, the rate at which they start spawning into the game world will increase, right? So there'll be more of them coming in faster as the game goes on. And you'll see on the inside of my shield, I can see my health. I can see my score, which is based on... Whoops, I clicked out of the game window and I paused it. Hold on one second.
Oh, there you go.
Well, I think that was enough of a preview. But on the inside of my shield, you saw a score. You saw a timer that indicated how long I survived. And you saw my current health value. So that's the basic setup of that game. And that game will continue. And enemies will continue to spawn in again at a accelerating rate. They'll start spawning in faster and faster as the game progresses. And the game will keep going until I run out of health because the enemies have gotten me so much. So that's a quick preview of the game and a high-level overview of the design. Natalie, I guess I'll pause and see if there's anything else you wanted to point out about the design.
Yeah, one thing I think is important to note about this game is because it was originally designed for VR, the player avatar is glued to the spot. So if you look at it in this context with Brian playing it here on the PC, it looks weird that he can't run out on that long platform there and position himself so that he can shoot the droids from a distance. But of course, in most VR games, what you're looking at is movement is complicated. If you know a little bit about virtual reality, of course, one of the problems is if you show someone inside of a virtual reality headset that they are moving in the virtual world and their real body is not, that can actually cause a really big perceptual disconnect that will make you nauseated. So the way a lot of virtual reality games solve that problem is just by assuming you can only stand in one place and creating fun gameplay, given that that's the case. So for this game, it might be a logical conclusion to say, let's create running and jumping on the level. And Brian and I might say to you guys, that's actually a good idea for a PC game, but in a VR game, we have this other design requirement that dictates that we create fun gameplay while you stand in one place.
Yeah, and that's a super important point. And I think as we probably in the afternoon session, because we're running short on time this morning, I think a good way to kick off the afternoon session will be we'll do another just quick playthrough for folks who haven't seen the game before, but just to refresh those of you who join us then too. And we'll sort of dissect some of the VR specific choices that are being made in this game. And the concept that Natalie is introducing of design requirements, or the other term you may have heard for things like that, are design constraints, right? These are certain things that as a designer, you have to take into account when you're making your game, right? And the platform you're making your game for, right? Whether that is a PC, a gaming console, a mobile device, right? Or in this case, VR, the platform you're making your game for imposes or creates certain design requirements and constraints, right? So if you're making a game for PC, for example, right, you can make your controls require keyboard and mouse, right? If you're making a game for a console, you've only got the abilities of the controller, right? If you're making a game for a mobile phone, you've got a touchscreen. And each of those different platforms has different, and the control schemes that they require have put different constraints on a game. For example, a platforming game like a traditional platformer like Mario plays pretty nicely with a controller, and they can even play okay with a mouse and keyboard, right? It is much harder, though not impossible, to make games like that work on a touchscreen device. You can do it, you can actually create some pretty satisfying experiences, but generally, because a touchscreen and a person using a touchscreen can't be as quick and responsive as a controller, platformers that work well on a touchscreen tend to have a little bit of a slower pace. They tend to be a little bit less about super precise platforming. They tend to, they could be a little bit more like moody, like they have a certain feel to them. They reward exploration more than like rapidly, jumping. Those are things as a designer you'll have to start thinking about. And so I think when we kick off our afternoon session, we'll talk a little bit about some of the design constraints on a VR game, right? Some of them are obvious, like the one that Natalie mentioned about movement. We'll talk about that in a little more detail. And some of them aren't quite as obvious. So I'll leave you with one thing to think about that we can, like that, which is if you noticed in the game, my score, my timer, and my health meter were all on the inside of my shield. When I held my shield up, you saw like there was a little digital screen on the shield with those numbers. So you're sort of something to think about before the afternoon session is why might that be? Why is it that in this game I've put that on the shield as opposed to, say, in a heads-up display just somewhere else on the screen like you would see in many games? So, Natalie, that's about our time for this morning. So I think, unless there's anything else you want to add to the VR discussion, I think we can probably sign off for now.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk a little bit more about that this afternoon. I think we should just leave the cliffhanger about why we don't have a HUD in that game in the same way that you would see in a more traditional FPS. And we'll hop back on here. Brian will be on at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Is that right?
Yep, 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific.
That's
All
right.
right. Well, everybody, thanks for joining us, and we will see you all later today. Thanks for
All
watching.
right.
Bye bye.